part 3 of the unification theory. Yeah, so link below to the document that I'm reading from. And so we're at the speaking of shadows part, which might be retitled, but we'll see. It is often the case that before a right idea can be seen, the wrong idea's blocking vision must be removed. That seems just such a fact of life. People just, their devotion blinds them. The aura of Jesus just breaks their vision. They can't see anything but the light of Jesus. And the same thing happens in science. They get a pet idea, and it's just their pet idea. Man, it's just, they hold it close to their heart. They pet it and stroke it. And they just really don't want to hear, hey, you're petting a praying mantis. Or, do you know that your, cat died 75 years ago? They just can't do that. So this is a big problem. And it's obviously, in my opinion, a big problem in science. Scientists are fundamentally, just like all the other assholes on Earth, they're religious kooks. I think before you can fairly judge this theory of fundamental function, you must be liberated from any hard conclusions if the questions have already been properly answered. Yeah, it'd be really great if I could just go back in time and then introduce this idea at the very same time Einstein introduces bent space and bent time as explanations for gravity and time dilation. Because this obviously makes a rational argument about why velocity changes the matter you are. It explains the question that's never been answered, what is inertia? It's a condition you have, that's right. You change. When you have velocity, you change. It's a fact. And gravity is the source of the most powerful force in the universe. And to shove all that energy into some fake dimension and say some fake dimension makes it is nothing better than leprechaunism. And so I think it would have been a much easier argument to win, before you all fell in love with Einstein's little lizard. 100 years ago, Albert Einstein proposed a vision of reality and provided some good mathematics. So again, you have to separate the idea that there's a connection between velocity and some kind of change in metabolism function. Change in function. Okay, let's just say clocks don't work well when they're moving fast. They don't work right. Any kind of mechanical device changes with velocity. Some sort of that relationship, and some notion that bending time did it. There's clearly a clear straight line on a graph kind of relationship. The more velocity, the more wacky the matter gets. So that relationship is pretty secure. Bent time doing it, that has nothing to do with the mathematical fact. And again, with gravity, it's the same thing. Well, I'll just do with the light thing with Newton again. We knew about Newton's rings back in Newton's day. Okay, the fact the phenomenon existed of apertures creating diffraction is not a new idea. Anyway, but this idea of gravity is just so much more overt. There's no connection. The convergence has been known about since Newton. Einstein's thing with Mercury just has to do with the fact that Einstein's accounting for the sun vibrating, but the sun vibrating has nothing to do, that there's no necessity to bend space to acknowledge that the sun would move its position as it's being tugged on by all these different entities, and that you have to account for that in the math, that the sun's position isn't stable. It isn't a zero. You can just put in the math sun's position and it's always the same number. No, it's never the same number. All right, and so the relationship between the Mercury thing and bent space is tangential. It is not a direct, clear dependency relationship. There's no dependency between one fact and the proposed fact of bent space. Now the rest of Einstein's theory, just covering gravity, is just rubbish. They don't even draw it right. I mean, the bent space is not bent, it's vertically stretched. This is the inverse square line. Okay, the inverse square rule is a straight frickin' line. It doesn't do any of this bendy crap. It's a straight frickin' line. Anyway, yeah, and it just creates silly things like singularities, infinitely deep wells that won't happen in reality, can't happen in reality. Gravity's not, there's not an infinite supply of gravity. It has a limit. Not anywhere proposed in Einstein's math or in his fundamental theory. But the idea of the math describing the convergence, the fact that things fall at a rate, things are pushed into at a rate, that was established by Newton. All right. 100 years ago, Albert Einstein proposed a vision of reality that provides some good mathematics. Over the years, physicists have converted that vision from theory to fact, claiming that it has predicted enough to have proven itself. Only the major prediction was that light is bent. Now, frankly, Newton proposed that. He didn't have any way to prove it. But it's all just based on a guess. You either guess light has mass and can be bent, or you guess light doesn't have mass and it can't be bent. Okay, so they guessed that it can be, and then they went out and they tried to find evidence of it. And clearly it can be argued that their evidence is rubbish. Just absolute garbage. And I think clearly also you can make rational arguments saying that light, unlike circular matter, has all of its mass going one direction. So in a tangential or sideways or perpendicular directions to gravity, it would have no mass. It only has mass in the direction it's traveling. And the reason why matter has mass in all directions is because it has bits moving in all directions. Sounds incredibly logical to me. Okay. So again, and this is clearly dependent on the idea, like I said, that they're basically saying that now the very idea of a convergence is dependent. Is every time you find evidence of something moving towards some other gravitational body, that somehow that's proof of bent space. It's not proof of the convergence that Newton knew about. It's not proof of gravity. No, it's proof of bent space. I would claim that the proof has been overstated. That's probably a grotesque understatement on my part. To call it overstated is to preposterously understate how insanely misrepresented the evidence has been. And that the fundamental theory was engineered only to answer specific questions. Einstein knew about the idea of Newton's question about whether light could be bent by gravity. Einstein knew of the convergence. Einstein had heard of this idea of velocity having a connection to the performance issues of some radioactive elements. This wasn't stuff he didn't know about, and he engineered a theory to answer questions that he kind of knew were in the future, and provides little as a complete and reasonable description of reality. Well, certainly that's true. At the cornerstone of Einstein's explanation is the concept of space-time. In brief, the idea is that non-material dimensions, so up, down, left, right, front, back, those things, now we have these new dimensions of space and time somehow connected. They're not functions in the three real dimensions. No, now they're separate dimensional things that somehow in special little ways warp or bend the other three dimensions. Act and react in the three material dimensions and provide energy for such things as gravity. And again, just understand that bent space-time is just a place to hide doing the real work of figuring out where does the energy come from to shove the Earth into the Sun? Where does the energy come from to shove galaxies into globular clusters or something? Where does the energy come from? And so instead of explaining where the energy comes from, they create a fake fabric so they can bend it, so they can make stuff fall down into it. And if they three-dimensionalize the model and make it more realistic, Then you end up with an idea of just going right back to the convergence again. An endless vacuum cleaner in the center of the sun just keeps pulling the space-time in. Yeah. No gasoline required, no oil, no anything to run that machine. It can just pull space-time forever. No work required. The most massive objects in the universe are moved by this substance, and yet nothing else that we know of can use it as fuel. Nothing else. Nothing. Magnets can't. Nothing can use this magic space-time as fuel. You know, the pulling of it. Anyway, we are to believe this fabric of reality bends, stretches, and dimples, and that matter obediently slides down the contour. So the nothing tells the something what to do, and the scientists all just bought it. They eat it. They said, okay, put nothing tells something what to do. Yes, put that on my plate, and I now will eat it. And I'm not supposed to say, no, that never sounded right, that can't sound right, that doesn't make any sense, and that's all I've said for my whole life since I first heard this crock of shit nonsense, is why are these people having a conversation about a leprechaun theory? This doesn't make any sense as an answer to the question. Why is there gravity? Oh, okay, the invisible dimension of fake space-time stretches and gets pulled into suns magically, deliciously. I mean, it's like the hat popping on the, they used to sell margarine. A little hat would pop on people's heads. I didn't believe those were real hats popping on people's heads like that. I knew it was a trick. Space-time is a trick. It has nothing to do with reality. Sorry, I'm being a little hostile. Commenters. Anyway, stretches, dimples. Alright, anyway. As a metaphor, this model may produce some useful images, but as an explanation of reality, it catastrophically fails coherency tests, especially drawn in 3 dimensions. In 3 dimensions, it basically just creates this thing that's pulling the invisible space-time in all the time, endlessly pulling, converging the space-time, and moving galaxies with it. Sorry, that's not, in my opinion, that isn't even close to a good answer. I'd rather go with rope theory than an eternal space-time pulling device. Anyway, the most glaring problem, though the model only really works visually in 2 dimensions, and obviously matter exists in 3, and when really analyzed, the model only really works if it uses the forces it's supposed to be explaining. Again, when you 2-dimensionalize it, you're using gravity to make stuff fall down, and when you 3-dimensionalize it, you're back to just a magical convergence. You're back to Newton, and you're back to saying, what causes gravity? Because, frankly, saying the sun endlessly pulls space-time into the center of it isn't much of an explanation. How exactly does the sun do that? Does the sun have incredible arm strength? I mean, how does it pull on space-time every day, constantly like that? Doesn't it get tired? Alright, anyway. For example, in the case of a convergence known as gravity, Einstein's model just basically says gravity is like falling down a well. And it's really nothing, it's not even better than that. And it's a silly, they don't even, again, draw it correctly. The inverse square rule does not create this. The inverse square rule creates this. Okay, not much better than saying the force of gravity comes from the force of gravity. So it's just a circular non-answer to the question. It's just as bad as saying God done it, and then I can just ask, well, where the hell did God come from? Who done God? Well, I'm going to ask you, who done space-time? How does the sun pull space-time? How does it do it? How does it engineer this mechanism to pull on space-time in 3 dimensions? Alright, seeing the light regarding light. If there was an original sin, so the whole point is that, yeah, there's no point in listening to anything I have to say if you're not going to get my theory fairly compete with Einstein's theory or with quantum mechanics. If you're just going to say they're God, you're not, they're Moses, you're Joe, whatever you're doing, then there's no point. I'm saying I'm giving you a rational, reasonable alternative to believing in leprechauns. You either get that or you don't get that. But this is so much simpler. Occam's razor test passed. This explains all the phenomenon. All of it. All of it. If there was an original sin that led to the corruption of physics, this was a perversion of the photon into a beast of complex function. Yeah. Read carefully, the Book of Photon is the Rosetta Stone of physics, translating big matter forces into small matter forces. So really, the photon is the thing, in the sense that photons allow us to see a mechanism that works in our reality, okay, but it also works in that tiny world too. So it works in this big world, and it works in this little world. And so that's the one that can really connect these two universes that we're seeing, the one outside of us and the one inside of us. And so if you get photon right, you'll get forces right. And in every way they could get photon wrong, they got photon wrong. Every time they were asked a 50-50 question about what a photon is, they chose the wrong answer. Alright, the new classic description of photons has it classified as some kind of electromagnetic thing. Yet there's little evidence it could do anything purely electrical or purely magnetic. In practical fact, photons without frequency, gravitons, magnetons, the tons, are the thing that makes magnetism and makes electricity and makes things move into each other. They do all of the force work. So, this idea that they can't be what they make. The ingredient can't be the finished cake, if you get what I'm saying. So this idea that photons have some sort of element in them that says I'm magnetic or I'm electric. No. They're light, they're a photon when they have a frequency and polarization. When they have just polarization, they're a magneton, and when they're just a ton, they're gravity. That's how it works. They don't have any. It's completely how they're conditioned will decide what they are, but they don't each carry a component of magnetism and a component of electricity. That doesn't exist. They contain no waveness. Yet there is little evidence it could do anything purely electrical or mechanical or magnetic. This classification isn't describing what photons are, it's describing what happens to photons, what happens when photons interact with matter. So the point is that stuff goes in to matter, the matter reacts and can produce photons at frequency, it can produce magnetism, which is photons without frequency but polarized, it can produce lots of different kinds of tons, okay, based on the migration of this field. The changes in the field, well, I don't want to get too specific. The field dynamics. The new physics not only has photons causing effect, it has them affecting effect. So we're sort of to the two-slit experiment and other nonsense where photons have wave radar, they have all kinds of functions, they make all kinds of decisions, they do all kinds of combining of, they conspire, hey, what are you doing, what are you doing, they figure out what each other's doing, do all this. No, none of that shit happens. The mechanism that's complex are the orbits. The mechanism that's simple, the little bits the orbits are made out of. Raindrop simple, hurricane complex. Starting over, let's list what we really know to be true about photons. They generally move from point A to point B in a straight line, at the speed of light. They generally move at 168,000 miles per second, the same transmission speed as gravity and magnetism. Not an uninteresting fact. And again, it's this general statement. People have interpretations and they say, well, light moves 40% slower through water. Not really. It's that it's going around the water molecules, you see. It's being transmitted through the water. It takes time to get transmitted because you have to go around the spins. Anyway, but I shouldn't have to explain that. There's other explanations for what appears to be slower speeds of light. Slower speeds of light doesn't necessarily mean the light went slower. Light goes slower through fiber optic cable. Why? Well, because it's bouncing constantly off the sides of the cable, so it's going a lot of distance to get from point A to point B. Come on, not complicated. They have a shape expressed as polarization. They are, this or this. They are identifiable by a carrier frequency. That's it for photons, right? The separated of distance, okay? So we have three words: frequency, wavelength, and period. All the same exact thing. It just has to do with how much distance is between ton and ton. And that's it. When emitted from a spherical object, they dissipate at the same rate as gravity and magnetism, obeying the inverse square rule. So they function exactly like gravity. When you expel them as gravitational bodies expel gravity, or when you expel them as magnets expel magnetism, photons behave exactly the same way as the forces in those two things, gravity and magnetism. Photons obey exactly the same rule. And again, not an uninteresting fact. I would argue that this list is substantially complete regarding what can be established as fact. Notice that nothing on the list precludes one from reasonably believing photons to be fundamentally small, discrete bits separated by a distance, frequency, wavelength, and little else. That's all they really are. Thing, quanton, 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 same difference, same polarization as they're emitted. So each electron emits a little stream of them, of all the same polarization. And the next electron might have a little slightly different polarization because its angles of its spin is a little different. So the polarization will be different for each electron as it releases some photons. But that's what you're seeing. When you see light, you're not seeing light from one electron. You're seeing light from a whole bunch of electrons, and each electron often has a different orientation, which means the polarization of the light is different. But each stream of light has exactly the same polarization, which makes it grabbable by the electrons that see the light. It has to be of a consistent polarization for it to see the individual streams of light. Alright. And when they can't be resolved, then they're just little gravitons again. I would argue that this list of the wavelength, once given permission to see photons in this form and realizing we don't see most of the light surrounding us, meaning most of the photons surrounding us, so most of the photons moving at a frequency around us. We are surrounded by cell phone, radio waves, microwaves, all kinds of goddamn fucking photons hitting us all the time, a huge magnitude of energy, really, compared to the amount of light we see. So the amount of light is a minute portion of the amount of things bombarding us every moment with a frequency. The imagination doesn't have to wander far to realize that the pool of unseen photons may be as deep as the proverbial gravity well. So I'm basically arguing that it doesn't take much imagination once you realize you don't even see most of the visible light. Most of the photons at frequency, the light spectrum from radio to cosmic. You don't see most of that you could imagine there might be the stuff moving planets could be something on either end of that scale that you're also not seeing. But you clearly can measure it anytime you want. There's its effect. It's doing something. There's the proof that it exists. Right there. Every material object will detect gravity. Every single one of them will detect the stream of photon force being imbalanced, having more of it going down than coming up. Every piece of matter will reveal its existence to you. Alright, in an effort to briefly tie this all together, photons are just a variety of quantons. So I've already said that. They acquire their identifiable orientation, frequency, occurrence, and polarization. This is something that matter produces. So matter produces photons at regular frequency and at consistent polarization. So you have to have something like an electron in existence before you can have photons technically, because technically you need something to create the frequency. So you need something with a spin to release it at the same rate. Constant spin, same rate. It's like when you know, they have this theory that there's something called antimatter, the anti-electron, and it meets the regular electron. And what really, I think, logically you can understand is happening is that two electrons with opposite spin collide, and they basically just rip each other open. And all of the electrons spill out of the two as they run into each other. It's like two saw blades spinning the opposite direction. They'll knock all their teeth off. Not complicated, and it'll all leave with a frequency. So they just basically grind each other right down to nothing. Perfectly rational explanation, isn't it? Yes. Alright. Anyway. Okay, so occurrence of polarization. As they are emitted from electrons, each electron emitting photons releases them in the same polarization. So I've already emphasized that. And at the same specific frequency. These are important things. So you understand something's spinning at a constant speed. Something precipitates it to have an imbalance. It releases some of its excess weight. It farts a couple of tons. Then it's going to fart them at the same rate. Different electrons in the same strata of light-emitting matter will release photons with a different polarization. So obviously, electrons at a different, like galaxies at a different angle, will throw, if they threw something, they're going to throw it at a different orientation. Okay, but each individual electron releases photons of only one polarization. In a sense, light is just a bit of gravity that has been labeled by its polarization and that can be detected based on the frequency of a quanta arriving with a specific polarization. So electrons have a lot of stuff hitting them, all this crap and the gravity shit. It's banging into them all the time and they ignore it. But if two of them come at the right rate and at the right angle, they will be captured. So it's like our solar system. Lots of stuff could fly through our solar system too fast to be captured at the wrong angle. But if it comes at the right angle, it can be captured by the sun. Anyway, once you accept this description of photons as a form of gravity, the next step of including magnetism is within reach. Ironically, duality physicists like Richard Feynman have used the term virtual photon to describe the unknown force carrier in magnetism. So when asked what magnetism was, Feynman used this. He basically implied, okay, there's like these virtual photons being emitted by the magnetism to create the field flux, so that this would be like a neutral spot, like it's getting hit from this direction, and it's essentially a neutral because this force is this force has got a certain strength, this force got a certain pull force, so the repulsion and the whatever the word I'm looking for, attraction balance out, and you have these points of this field line are really where you end up with a balance of the two forces based on the angle of the magnetized substance. So it always has to be a magnetized substance in this field line, but they're really just lining up with how the balance of pull and push exists with another magnet, so to speak. And Feynman's argument was that the virtual photons are the thing creating that balance. So he invented basically the thing. So it's kind of ironic that he had it in his hand. He had the truth right in his hand, and he blew it. Anyway, to describe the unknown force carrier in magnetism, seems he couldn't see the quantum forest through the wavy trees. So that's just kind of a dig at the fact that he had it. He had it in the sense that he wanted a theory that was like a checkerboard. There's so many little elements where he was just so close to getting it right. And again, having this idea of something creating a flux, and then you move the flux, and that creates movement in the other matter. He knew this translation. There had to be a mechanical force that's doing that. So he knew, just saying the word virtual photon is just basically saying graviton all over the place. Magneton. And he was just afraid to say the word. Alright. Anyway, like photons, the force expressed in magnetism is just a variety of gravity, or more specifically, a subtle variation in the active universal quantum field. So you have this huge field of all these little bits moving the speed of light that just kinetically interact, and if they're labeled specific ways and you create specific filters, you can amplify, in a sense, their effect or amplify their production in a certain condition. And that's what we are made out of, is the consequence of that fact, that orbit is different than straight line, and it just changes everything fundamentally. Let's start, so regarding magnetism, let's start with what might be an agreeable statement to most physicists. Magnets are filters that produce and are sensitive to polarization. So we already have the right word. We already talk about them being polarized, the North Pole, the South Pole, so they sort of already have that part. And all they have to do is really just think about it as a light filter, and then impose on the light filter the fact that the light gets blocked more, that it applies hundreds of times more force when it hits the filter but doesn't pass through the filter. And if they just add that one little condition of the light photon would become 100 times more forceful when it hit but couldn't get through, they would have the idea, they would notice how the filter would move based on the polarization of the light. And they could see magnetism, in a sense, with using regular light photons, if they had enough imagination just to do that. But that's all that magnetism is doing. Magnetism isn't just filtering, it's reacting to the polarization. It's acting differently to the different light as it's polarized. All right. If we can agree on that, then the only really important question to be answered is, what is getting polarized? In the context of this paper, this question has too simple an answer for me to ask it without feeling silly. I mean, obviously it's the quantons. The quantons, the gravity is going in, it's getting filtered. The filters create a sensitivity that this pole is invisible to, and so they just end up reversing the magnitude of the gravity. They just make the gravity hundreds or thousands of times more effective by polarizing it. Obviously it's the quantons, gravitons, quantons, stupid. I would argue that one of the strongest proofs of the theory of gravity proposed in this paper is the fact that it provides all the ingredients to solve the mystery of magnetism. Yes, this is just, in a sense, how can you say it's just an accident? It's an accident that a theory that started off as just an explanation of gravity ended up doing inertia, time dilation, and now perfectly explains magnetism. Now, to say that's realistic, is a roll of the dice kind of scenario, that isn't essentially as preposterous as saying as getting 5 Yahtzee dice to stand on their own heads. What are the odds that a wrong conclusion, a wrong description, could end up fundamentally and clearly describing inertia, time dilation, and magnetism? I'd say the odds are insanely preposterous that you could make a fake theory that could do that by accident. Again, I didn't start with any of those expectations. I started with an expectation to explain gravity and ended up with time dilation and magnetism. Once you place two magnets in an active universal quantum field, diagramming what will happen is a little more challenging than a grammar school exercise. First, there needs to be agreement on the general description of a polarizing filter. Yeah, I might as well read this, but the point is I'm just going to describe look, polarized filters are lines in plastic, and the lines are just basically creating jail cell bars, and the stuff that's going this way can get through the bars, the stuff that goes this way can't get through the bars. It's something that simple. Alright. Alright. In the applicable circumstance of visible light, a polarizing filter would consist of a gradient of lines that can be oriented vertically or horizontally. Horizontal, vertical. And can filter out different photons based on the orientation of the filter. So only certain ones would get through this, and only certain ones would get through this. Light polarizing filters also convert light in a range of polarization to a specific output polarization. So ones that came in a little bit off would get bent this way. and ones that came in a little bit off of vertical would get bent vertical. So it's making polarization. Alright, the polarization material of magnets works much the same way in that it can ignore, absorb, or convert what travels through it. So this graviton can get ignored, it can be totally transparent, it can be totally blocked, or it can be blocked and oriented, blocked and converted. Alright, let's use the example of two magnets with opposite poles facing each other. The normal field pressure at regular gravity surrounds them and penetrates them from all directions. So it's just this idea, and the field is all around them. There is a minor amount of gravitational attraction between them, but too little to be of any relevant consequence. So their matter, without filtering, ends up reacting to all the polarization in some even manner. So most of it just passes right through them. They don't block much, and so their density ratios are too weak to have any real gravitational attraction. There's a minor amount of okay. The important thing happening is that the magnetic poles are filtering the gravity quantons as they pass through them, greatly magnifying the regular material effect. So the idea is that now, because they're polarized, they're converting. All right, the regular gravity can become much stronger because the thing here that's feeling the gravity can produce a kind of polarization that the other side won't feel at all. It'll go right through. And it can create a kind of polarization that'll feel twice as strong. And that ability to produce the things it's guaranteed to react to 100% of the time, where before the regular gravity is only 1% of the time, is the material affected. 1% of the gravity, let's say, affects it. Once it's polarized, and it's in the presence of another polarizing filter that's producing 100% of a certain kind of polarization, now it will be affected by 100% or 90% or 80% of the gravity passing through it. So much higher percentage. I'm using these percentages. It's probably much lower percentages than those, but the dramatic difference between 1% and 40%, let's say, is dramatic. Unlike regular matter, the magnetic polar filters are doing three important things regular matter doesn't do. Magnetic polar filters double the absorption rate of one specific polarization. So the red side gets sensitive to this, the blue ones get sensitive to this, double. Reduced to zero the absorption rate of tangential polarization, so perpendicular polarization. So the red side is invisible to this, and the blue side is invisible to that, kind of a thing. Convert at a rate proportional to density the quantons in any polarization to a specific polarization that's twice the effect. So this red produces it's twice as affected by this kind of polarization, and ends up producing all that kind of polarization. So when the stuff goes through at regular gravity, it changes it into polarized gravity that this thing is 0% affected by, and that's why these two magnets will push together. Alright. In figure 1, the effect is crudely diagrammed. The arrows labeled 2x represent specific polarization of the magnetic pole is twice as likely to absorb and gain acceleration from. So this is there's some 2x in the regular gravity field, but obviously once it goes through this magnet, then it's all 2x. And this one's obviously inverted, so if it was hitting this one, it would be pushing it away really hard, but since it's going to the side that's 0 affected by that red polarization, it goes right through, and that's why the external field now pushes these two ends together. And obviously it happens exactly the same way at the bottom, and that's why the magnets are attracted. They're not attracted, they're pushed together by the same force that pushes the Earth into the Sun. Alright, convert at a rate proportional to density quantons of any polarization of absorbs twice as effect. So again, this polarization thing changes regular gravity into polarized gravity, and the polarization is twice as strong a reaction. and 0, which is the opposite of twice. So if you do, the 2 plus 0 is the same as 1 plus 1. So that's why the net gravitational effect is unaffected, is because the 2x ones are compensating for the 0 ones, if you understand it gravitationally. So it stays a neutral to gravity. I think I say that here. The arrows labeled 0 represent the specific polarization the magnetic pole will not absorb. Notice the balancing effect of these inverse values keeps the net gravitational impact neutral. So understand, 2 plus 0 is the same as 1 plus 1. The arrow marked with a G represents 98% of the gravity that is in some other polarization. So these G's are here. That's most of the gravity. Only 1% of the gravity is in the perfect polarization, and there's only 1% that's in the complete 0 configuration of polarization. So 98%, that's where I get 98% from, because we have 360 degrees of polarization. So the arrow marked with a G represents 98%. It is the conversion of some portion of this gravity of random polarization to the 2x polarization, which is the 0 polarization for the opposite pole, that gives the magnetism its greatly magnified effect over regular gravity. So it's taking this regular multiple polarizations and converting them into strong polarization for red, or weak polarization for blue. That just completely magnifies the effect of gravity, and it just depends on what percentage of gravity is end up getting polarized. It could be 40% of that 98%, it could be 90%, I'm not sure of that. Clearly there would be a size limitation to how big a magnet you could build, and the magnet would get more magnetic. So, because then you would know what the 0 is. So there's a 0, you know, where you create a perfect vacuum here by converting all of the gravity to this polarization. But you'd probably need a magnet the size of the Earth to do that. That gives magnetism its greatly magnified effect over regular gravity. As opposed to poles produce much larger amounts of polarization that is invisible, the opposite poles produce much larger amounts of polarization that is invisible to the other pole. There is essentially created between the magnets extra low pressure gravitational pressure zone. So exactly, the 0, this is creating the polarization this one can't see, this one's creating the blue is creating the polarization the red can't see, so the two just end up pushing right through each other, and the external force pushes the magnets together. Really simple. An example of the same poles facing each other demonstrates the opposite effect, create essentially more gravitational pressure between the magnets. So this is just the opposite thing happening, where all of the gravity now is being converted into 2x gravity. The 2x is the blue hates the 2x. I mean, the 2x creates more force. So what you just end up doing is creating the polarization it's more sensitive to. There's a lot more force in between them now, because they're both, it's all polarized force, and so the magnets are pushed apart because the force effect is magnified because it's all 2x gravity. So you can see this is mostly dominated by this blue field because all the gravity is being converted into blue. This one is strongly reacts away from blue, and that's it. And so the red is almost irrelevant in this equation. So it's even simpler to see in the circumstance where magnets are repelled, because you can see that it's the 2x conversion to the 2x repulsion that makes the whole thing happen. Okay. As both poles produce the same twice as strong polarization, both magnets are accelerated away from each other. This should be noted that the 2x gravity is just only 1 order of magnitude stronger than regular gravity. So it also has to be understood that 2x is only 1 more than 1. See, this should be a 1. So it's not like it's twice as strong as 0. It's 1 time stronger than 1 time. Just to be clear. I mean, I know that didn't sound clear, but it's 2 is only 1 plus 1. It's not 1 plus 2. As with gravity, magnetism is merely the byproduct of a created imbalance in field pressure. Much is made of the fact that these two forces have substantial difference in magnitude to be unified. I would counter that some force is merely being imbalanced through different mechanisms. So the same force is being imbalanced through different mechanisms. So the argument is gravity is creating an effect, but it's because its effect is not using polarization. It's not taking advantage of any nuance in the field, and so its composition takes less out of it absorbs less of the energy, where magnetism is obviously, again, it's not just that it's feeling the energy, it's that it's converting the energy, and it's that conversion and its capacity to sense the conversion, to be affected by conversions, is what makes magnetism happen. So it's all just about composition. Through different mechanisms. Gravity creates imbalance through mass, while magnetism creates imbalance through composition. So understand, it does it because the magnetic material has a specific capacity to create this filtering mechanism that also creates a polarizing mechanism. It polarizes the gravity as it goes through it. If you were to imagine two massive black holes separated by a few meters, you would be struck, and you were stuck between them. Do you think you would argue that gravity is a weak force? So if you just imagine yourself, imagine the power of the gravity of two black holes, a few feet apart. Just an incredible acceleration force. If you were holding them from each other, it would take all the energy of like the universe to keep them apart. That's how strong the force of just gravity is. So I'm just giving you an example that there's a point where composition becomes irrelevant when you have enough mass. So if you have enough mass, then you're using all the gravity. But if you don't have much mass, you're not using much. But composition can make you, in a sense, more massive to gravity. All right. Yeah, I think so. So anyway, so for the purpose of unification, it seems quite obvious that the two forces, it's just a level of magnitude, a strength of how much you're gleaning out of it, or how much you're filtering out of it, right? So if I was a water filter and you pour dirty water into me, I'm going to get heavy and I'm going to get pushed by all the dirt in the water. But if I don't have a filter, then the water's just going to go right through. If I'm not filtering the bigger particles or the littlest ones, then the water will go through me much easier, a lot less force. So there's more force if I'm filtering. Kind of obvious. All right. I think it will be understood that as a kind of rule that the mass increase, as mass increases, the relevance of composition decreases. So what I'm arguing is as you make something more massive, it doesn't matter whether it's magnetic anymore, because now it's filtering all the gravity. So the more massive it is, it's going to filter all the dirt. Okay, it just doesn't matter. If you make the filter thick enough, it's going to get all the dirt. And it doesn't need to be a special filter that collects the dirt. Okay. So we made it. I haven't written a conclusion yet. Yeah, that'll be it for now, and do a few corrections. Maybe go to perpendicular instead of tangential, and but I don't think anything else needs to be changed by anything anybody said, because no one's really said anything reasonable. There's really no way to dispute this rationally, in my opinion. It's just too frickin' obvious. It fills all the gaps. This is the missing link. I mean, this is like finding a human, with a rock razor in his hand or something. It's just too. It's just too perfect, too complete, too good, too rational, too sensible, too logical, too. Oh yeah, that's a lot better than endlessly eating bent space. Yeah. Lots better. Anyway, thanks for listening. Anyway. Yeah. Appreciate that. Don't like what's going on in your head, probably, though. Whatever crap is going on in your head is just crap. You just gotta let go of the Jeebus theory just for a minute. Just think about it. Evolution. Simple. Really simple. Really simple. It's just crap banging into each other. And it gets in orbits. I have to make more swirly things. Maybe I have to have a picture of a swirly thing in here somewhere. On the home page of the website, it has, I think is the picture still at the bottom of this page? No, I probably didn't add it here. What there used to be. Oh yeah, well there's a swirly fish. It's a swirly fish. It's all about the swirl, baby. Not the motion of the ocean, it's the swirl of the twirl or something. The twirl of the swirl. Yeah. The twirl of the swirl. Okay. Till next time.